Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Leading with Humanity. Our speaker today is Mirella Hernandez, Associate Professor of Business Administration, and the Donald and Lauren Morell Emerging Scholar in Business Administration at the University of Virginia Darden School of Business. Mirella, welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me, Paul.
Delighted you're here. So before we dig in, a couple of quick programming notes. For those of you who have joined us for previous webinars, we're going to do something a little bit different today. We're going to begin with a quick poll and then some opening remarks by Mirella. Then we're going to dedicate the rest of our program to a conversation and workshop style format in which we field your questions throughout the full session. So please feel free to submit questions as soon as you'd like. So let's begin with an opening poll.
Okay, thank you. And again, I appreciate the opportunity. It's a privilege to join you and our viewers today. So I'd like to start by framing the problem, and this is where the poll comes in. Now, this is just how I see things as a social scientist, and this is a way that often we organize complex systems in social life in terms of levels of analysis. And so what I'd like you to think about is, which do you believe is our biggest leadership challenge during the pandemic? And I'll walk us through each of these levels. So if we look at the individual level factors, this could include challenges such as lacking a coherent direction from individual leaders, not having an inspirational vision on how to deal with the crisis. Those would be individual level factors. Relational level factors could include our inability to connect interpersonally because of social distancing, coupled with perhaps the psychological strain of witnessing loss of life. Those factors at the relational level have had a pretty deep impact on our mental health. Another level is the collective level, where the demise of many businesses in our local communities might inhibit our rapid economic recovery. And then the final level, the context factors, include our global environment. If the virus continues to be somewhere, it is anywhere. And without increased global transparency or cooperation, coordinated support, the pandemic is unlikely to end very soon. So as you think about the individual, relational, collective, and contextual levels, what do you think is our biggest leadership challenge during this COVID-19 pandemic?
Okay, and our results are in. And Mirella, I just want to confirm with you that you're able to see the results, and if not, I'll read them to you.
I am, and it looks that interesting that relational level factors and collective level factors are the highest, falling behind context and individual levels. So let me talk a little bit about each of these, because as you probably guess, and since I'm a professor, the answer isn't just one. It depends, and the answer is more nuanced. The crisis is hitting us at every level, and so let me discuss some insights about what we can do to lead with humanity within this larger, complex social system. So let me begin with the individual level of analysis. Now, what we know from social science and behavioral science in particular is that people have limited cognitive capacity in times of crisis because they're bombarded with new information that they have to process, right? And so it's very common for us to have cognitive overload that can impede accurate or effective decision making. It's difficult to understand what information to process first, how to interpret it, and how to know how it fits into the larger picture. In my own research, I've written about this issue and emphasized that when the options are too complex, in particular during crisis situations, people start taking cognitive shortcuts because of the psychological discomfort of that overload. I've also written actually for Sloan Management Review about the impossibility of focusing on two things at once. As humans, we are serial processors. We need to have some bit of guidance about what to process first so that we can focus on that. And in these situations, such guidance typically comes from an external source, such as a leader. It's crisis leadership 101, right? In organizations, take for instance, the example of enacting large organizational change initiatives. I consult with a great number of organizations that are designing and executing large-scale change. When change efforts are afoot, what you typically see is that the CEO and his or her top management team, they essentially become a broken record. They repeat the same simple message over and over and over every time that they speak to their employees. That's so that one simple message can guide a very large number of employees in times of uncertainty. That message typically is also both specific and grounded in common values. During our current crisis, we heard from mainly government actors that social distance was important to flatten the curve. This message was said over and over in throughout different communication channels. In the UK, that message was similar. Stay home, protect the NHS, save lives. We saw that in every single press conference. The NHS, of course, is the umbrella term for the publicly funded healthcare systems of the United Kingdom. Now, this clear, simple, often repeated message of social distance helped us cut through our cognitive overload by focusing on what each person should prioritize in the immediate term and why. But if we go beyond our immediate term, beyond March and April, during our initial reply and response to the current situation, things become less clear. In the US, our response to this pandemic has been fractured. Some states are reopening, some are not. The message from the White House has been unclear, if not contradictory and alarming at times. Our cognitive load is arguably increasing, and soon, without a clear guiding message that is repeated over and over, a message that draws on our collective values, I would argue we risk the same level of cognitive overload and emotional paralysis that many of us felt at the start of this pandemic. So how a leader frames a situation is incredibly meaningful to how we understand and respond. We respond to crisis more effectively when it's framed as an opportunity to rise to the occasion, as an exercise of individual agency in our values, that here in the US, we are one United States and that we're in this together. This is a very different framing than telling people that this crisis is somebody else's fault. When blame is our primary framing, what it does psychologically is that it undermines our individual initiative. It compromises people's ability to feel a sense of efficacy and control in responding in a crisis. When our aspirational values are the framing, the opposite happens. We tend to exceed our own expectations of what's possible. We work twice as hard for twice as long because of this aspirational frame. I can say a lot more about the individual level of analysis and what individual level factors in particular as it relates to leadership play a role here, but let me move on to the second level factors that you saw in the poll. Relationships. During the lockdowns, we've seen an increase in mental health problems as individuals are isolated in their home with little interpersonal contact beyond their computer screens. We've seen domestic abuse significantly increase as the ability to create space from unhealthy interpersonal relationships has diminished. Social isolation, while medically beneficial, has placed the most vulnerable among us in greater psychological risk. This risk has hit medical professionals particularly hard. Mental health, if you consider that it's a taboo topic in many countries, and I would argue still probably in the US, this issue has now been placed front and center. And in my opinion, it has highlighted our basic human need to be with each other. Let me move on to the collective level, and I want to focus specifically on local communities. For instance, we know a lot about how local communities play a role. Some research by colleagues, Rao and Grave in 2017, they looked at the Spanish flu and actually community responses to the Spanish flu. And this research is published at the Academy Management Journal. They found that communities with good volunteer networks respond better to disasters because these communities are connected They have the infrastructure and the network of relationships to actually make things happen pretty quickly. Rao and Grave point out that local volunteer networks can strengthen their communities by providing training and the foundations for cultural and structural support that's very much needed to rebuild after a catastrophe. My research with current and past colleagues at the Darden School UVA on organizational resilience supports this assertion. When we have found that the community's response and more than that, the active involvement of community members as it's related to an organizational crisis is directly related to the organization's ability to recover and thrive post-crisis. Supporting local businesses through community-based coalitions is a promising step. It's one that we are doing here in Charlottesville as the University of Virginia partners with community-based organizations in Charlottesville. It's one way we can start addressing the economic collapse that's happening at the city and the state level. So essentially, we know that an intentional focus and action by local communities will improve response and recovery efforts. So let me focus on that final lens through which we can better understand complex social systems, and that's context. And by that, I mean the environment that includes cultural norms, the government, and so forth. And as I see it, often individuals think that context is something that just exists. We think that it exists in a very passive way, but through our scholarship, we know that context exerts active influence on our decisions. So let me give you some examples. In the US, our attention has been on flattening the curve. But if we look at other nations, that hasn't necessarily been the chief objective because it can't be. Take Latin America, for example. In the US, we are, I would say, often sheltered from the news abroad, but I would invite our viewers and listeners today to spend 30 minutes reading about what is happening in countries like Brazil, Ecuador, Peru, El Salvador. You will be heartbroken to see the mass graves that have been dug to bury hundreds, if not thousands. Testing isn't even a remote possibility. Neither is handling the influx of the sick in an already weak or non-existent public health system. In the context of the developing world, people are not flattening the curve. People are planning for and trying to mitigate impending famines. They're seeking unused land to try to increase their food production. So contrast that context with our context in the US. We've had significant supply chain issues that have caused farmers to destroy tons of produce and dump thousands of gallons of milk down the drain. Our US context is completely different. And in fact, our first world problems could solve the difficulties that others are experiencing, right? So how can we get those tons of produce to countries that are starting to experience widespread famine? If we can get a banana from Costa Rica to the US so that it's included in my Whole Foods delivery order, can we not ship excess food to those most in need, whether it's abroad or in the US to those experiencing food insecurity? Again, at the same time as the US is compared to a number of other global contexts, we've been compared to countries that have incredibly different governance structures, public health infrastructures, and are vastly smaller in scale than the US. Now, the benefit in these comparisons, I would argue, is not to critique the current government, but to learn what we can transfer and adapt to our context. I think that is an area of opportunity. Take, for instance, our growing concern and focus on contact tracing. If we look at Asia and Africa, regions that have learned a great deal from past epidemics such as SARS and Ebola, we know that contact tracing takes an army of people to be carried out effectively. Then consider our unemployment number, the greatest since the Great Depression. We could consider retooling and employing some of the millions of Americans that are out of work to help in the monumental task of contact tracing. Could we leverage our local community networks at the city and the state level to generate a workforce of contact tracers? Doing so would, again, require a high-level mandate from our leaders, an inspirational vision of solidarity to bring us together. So look, leading with humanity is not simple. This, of course not. This pandemic has hit us at every level. But I would argue it's not an impossible task. We know from social science how to address some key issues at the individual, relational, collective, and context levels. The trick is that we have to do this all at once and in collaboration with each other. The trick is that we need to be inspired by our leaders to move forward coherently and consistently together. The trick is that we need to tap into our individual values within each of our contexts so that we can recognize our common humanity. So I'll stop there. Those are some initial thoughts that I've had as we have been faced with this incredible leadership challenge.
Thank you, Mirella. That's a kind of a terrific framing for the rest of our conversation and a huge amount to explore. So I'm torn. Do we start with the challenge or the opportunity? But let's start with some challenges and kind of work our way to some opportunities.
Sounds good.
You know, I'd like to let's start by talking about kind of local leadership versus higher level leadership, whether it's governmental or organizational. Mm-hmm. Can local leadership be a antidote or remedy for ineffective higher level leadership, whether we're speaking about a government or an organization? What are your thoughts on
that? What I have seen, and this is both in past research and current projects, and increasingly I've done a lot of qualitative research where I interview leaders and actors within either an organization or a social system. And what I see again and again is that local leaders are an important piece of the puzzle, but without a guiding vision, we are less likely to succeed in making sustainable change. What we also know, though, is that in times of crisis, it creates an opportunity for individuals to rise to the occasion. And on my way to this webinar today, I was thinking of Martin Luther King, and I teach the case in my leadership classes. And as we look in hindsight, we think he was extraordinary. As we study the history of how he rose to that position, he was a leader at the right time, right, in the right place, with the right people around him to support him and to guide him in taking a leadership role. And so as we think about our current crisis, I would say we have an incredible opportunity to identify new leaders among us and offer support in any way we can to develop that guiding vision.
I think a lot of people are trying to kind of sort out their own agency as leaders, right? Mm-hmm. And trying to figure out when is it right for me to step up, whether I'm tasked with interpreting perhaps a somewhat vague high-level direction and making it actionable, or if I'm genuinely feeling that I have a moral responsibility to step into a vacuum or even to counteract poor guidance from above. How do we summon this isn't a question you can answer, but I'm interested in just exploring this a little bit further. But not to make things difficult for you, Mirella, but I think it's a really fascinating question. I think a lot of people are thinking about this. Like, what are the boundaries that I should be thinking about for myself as a leader? When do I step up? When is it appropriate? And kind of in a similar vein, how much political retribution, again, whether we're talking about office politics or governmental politics, should I be risking to step into a void and try to play a productive role?
Well, so I'll answer it in a couple ways. One that's perhaps much more of a personal response, and the other a much more structured answer. A personal response is that when we start focusing on the trade-off that we have to make between spending social capital and helping others, that's when we get into a mindset of trying to minimize risk, right? To prevent bad things from happening to the individual, to yourself. And that, I would argue, is actually the way to make the least amount of positive impact among our community members, among our organizational colleagues. When we start focusing on others in terms of what are their problems, what are my areas of expertise, what are my connections, what's my social network look like, and how can I tap into it to leverage resources that would not otherwise be available to these people in need. Your focus is on action. Your focus is generative. And what we know is that, through this generativity, you inspire others to do the same. That's how you actually build your leadership capacity. And so it's I would say to think about the boundaries of your leadership is counterproductive to just thinking about what is needed and how can I help in small ways. So let me talk a little bit more structured about how you can help. Is that all right?
Absolutely.
So I have been thinking a lot about this because I think as soon as we start to think about how can I help others, we're starting to make progress. I read a wonderful article by the BBC. It was published May 1st by writer Chung. They put out 10 different ways that we can help. So I want to put that to our viewers while adding some to the list and perhaps giving some specific examples on what each individual person can do. So one is obviously stay home, follow local social distancing guidelines. Another easy one is donate blood. A third that has been talked about is help your local community with care packages or doing organizing to create PPE, donating food. A fourth is figuring out where your skills are needed, right? And this can be, when we think about volunteering, we often think about our personal sphere of influence, right? Our home lives. But we're in this crisis that is crossing all sorts of boundaries. And so I would urge our viewers to think about, professionally, what are you in terms of your expertise positioned to contribute? What is your organization positioned to do, and how are they positioned to contribute? So not just within our local communities, but I think for those of us who are lucky enough to still have our jobs, thinking about how can I make a difference through those institutions. A fifth way to help and contribute is to spend money on causes and businesses that you believe in. And I'll give you an example of what I've been doing, my family has been focusing on. As soon as the devastation, the economic devastation became clear, we made a conscious effort to only try to spend our money locally. So this includes, a community shared agriculture, the CSA, buying from local vineyards and breweries, thinking about, if our kids have a summer reading list, could we order those books from a local bookstore instead of ordering them from Amazon? Things that perhaps are not as convenient, especially with the requirements to stay home. But I think if we all took a little bit of time to think about how we can essentially direct our resources into the local small businesses, it would help a great deal. 6 that is mentioned is writing letters to isolated friends and family or even strangers. My daughter actually has been writing letters to individuals in nursing homes through her school. She's also created actually paper puzzles that she has then put into packages and shipped to children who are in detention centers at the southern border of the US. Again, through social connections that her teachers have to individuals living in Texas and California. A 7th idea is keeping a diary. And this has 2 benefits. One benefit is that if you keep a diary, practically, when we do start contact tracing, you'll be better positioned to understand where you were, what you were doing, who you were interacting with. From a psychological standpoint, we know from psychological research by Pennebaker that writing, especially when we're troubled, when we have trauma, writing about those circumstances, writing about how we feel and how we're processing it, allows a more effective and more rapid recovery from those events. So keeping a diary. An 8th way to help is to figure out what marginalized groups in your community need, right? Can you build or join coalitions? Public-private partnerships are a wonderful example of this, right? What does your organization do and how can it contribute to those marginalized groups? A 9th way is help friends and family with childcare related issues. Now, this can be as simple as reading a book, structuring a workout or an activity to keep kids busy while their parents are trying to get through a workday. But it can also mean partnering with a local library or museums to volunteer your time to help kids who currently don't have educational support. With most, if not all, the schools closed in the US, there are many children who are missing out from a third of their school year. So being able to leverage those local community networks and offer that expertise in that way might be one way to help. And I mentioned local libraries and museums because the school systems themselves are currently completely overburdened and are very unlikely to be able to leverage individual volunteers while they're trying to pivot to online learning. 10th is don't spread misinformation. Take that extra second to check that what you've received in your feed, in your news feed, is actually true before you send it on. So those are the 10 that are mentioned in the BBC article that I cited. I would add 2 more, and they're more again, based on my psychological background and really thinking about, how do we improve our overall well-being. In this crisis, I think many of us are starting to reevaluate the relationships, personal relationships that we have. Whether you want to take that extra step to reach out to someone, or whether you're actually drawn to call someone that you haven't spoken to in a very long time. I see this as a perfect opportunity to reevaluate who gives us energy, right? Who are the individuals in our lives that perhaps we've neglected because of work schedules and family demands, but are people that we love and again, re-energize us. Thinking about how you can refocus your efforts there could have long-term positive consequences. And then a final one is I've been thinking a lot about habits. And some of us have been able to, while working from home, improve our cooking skills. Some of us are perhaps more active than we were because our schedule is more flexible. We can take a call while we're walking around a neighborhood or a park and still keep working. So whether it's that or whether it's on the other side of things where you're starting to do, you're displaying behaviors that you would otherwise not display and they're not positive, right now, because of the amount of change, is a perfect time to rethink what habits do I actually want to keep and which habits do I want to let go of. We are in a perfect position to establish new routines to reinforce those habits. Probably more than you wanted, Paul.
No, that's a fantastic list, and I'm sure a lot of people are kind of scribbling notes as you talked through them. You know, when you began that list, I expected it to be, let's call it the frosting on the cake, meaning that if we think about the cake as kind of a response to the crisis, right? We expect
Are you hungry?
We expect, yeah, a little bit. We expect institutions, we expect government institutions to providing the cake, and this kind of these individual acts of our best selves. You know, I expect it to be the icing, but actually, as you describe it, they actually feel like the cake. They feel like a responsibility rather than an opportunity. Am I overstating that?
No.
Is there an effective recovery without this type of behavior?
I would say, in particular, in the circumstance where there's no higher level mandate, there's no recovery without these individual efforts. And if we look at our, at least in the U.S., historical events, in the world wars, we saw massive mobilization by those left behind, right? And as we think about our individual agency, much of what the world looks like today here in the US is due to the individual efforts of Americans doing the most that they could with very little resources, trying to help in any way they can.
You mentioned the importance of context in your opening remarks, and your point in that wonderful list about not spreading misinformation, I think kind of ties to that. Context is a huge challenge for us today. The context that powerful voices provide may be inaccurate or even purposefully incomplete, to be generous. In fact, we don't often share the same context depending on our media, and social consumption habits. My context isn't your context. How do we, that seems like a huge stumbling block.
It is. It is, and it's a stumbling block that we discussed before the pandemic. A stumbling block where in fact, essentially different portions of our population have compartmentalized themselves with a different set of socially constructed norms and a different reality. And so it's an incredibly important and tragic stumbling block to bringing us back together.
Yeah, which I think returns us to the importance of individual agency, right? And being effective as humans. We have a long list of questions coming in from our audience, so I'm just going to kind of move into taking them, in some semblance of order. So I think one of the first questions we got in is, how can we capitalize on the trust and the relationships that that managers are building with their teams right now during this time of crisis? I think a lot of, for many of us, it's been an opportunity to solidify and kind of round out relationships that feel more human, going back to the point of this. How do we think about capturing that for the long term and making sure that, we don't lose the opportunity to build richer relationships as we emerge from this thing, whatever that means?
Well, by all experts' accounts, it's going to be with us for a while.
Yeah.
And if we go back to my comment regarding habits and new routines, I think that's one way to answer this question is not just that you're building this trust and then you're hoping to carry on with that level of trust going forward, but rather that you're building the routines that maintain and strengthen your relationships with others. And we're in a very unique situation where we are now witnessing a lot of the parts of people's lives that used to be behind the curtain, right? And when you see, you know, kids and dogs and cats running in the background, and unexpected things happening during calls, and you have to, you know, react with, you know, compassion and patience, it is stretching our ability, I think, as individuals in an organization to not just expect productivity from our individual employees, but rather for them to become full members of a community. And so I think that in how we have now adapted to the, sort of this new normal, I would encourage managers to think about the importance of understanding people's context. In the U.S., we are we're very likely to want, in situations where there's a deadline, to ask a lot from our employees, often called panic work. You know, you have a deadline, you have to work extra hours, but the situation now is that you actually, even though you're in people's homes, you don't know all of their responsibilities. They could be caring for a loved one. They could themselves be feeling sick, but not wanting to disclose that. We have to be able to allow people some more bandwidth. And I think routines that reinforce that, communication that reinforces that and allows a two-way flow of information, makes it a safe space for employees to express those issues. All of those actions, I think, are going to help us maintain and strengthen interpersonal trust.
We certainly see that play out, you know, in the Sloan Management Review organization. We adopted a rule that many organizations did early on. No apologies, right? If you're interrupted in the middle of a Zoom call, so be it. If you have to get up and do something when in the middle of the meeting, absolutely not a problem. And that led to this interesting effect where we're actually looking for that now from each other, right? I'm never more popular in a meeting than when my dog is with me. And that goes for other people. It's just fascinating to me how physical distance has created actually stronger personal connections. And I think that's really encouraging.
Yeah.
Next question. What have you found to be the single most difficult issue during this time in a big picture psychological sense? Is there one thing that you're seeing as being the biggest psychological challenge that organizations or individuals have to overcome?
So I'll mention two, three. I have not been getting a lot of sleep. I've been thinking about these things a bit much, perhaps. I don't know. So one is, I mean, this issue of framing around, you know, in the U.S. response. Do we blame someone, whether it's a different country, whether it's an international organization, whether it's a political party, whether, you know, that type of blame actually undermines our ability to respond. And I think that there's a huge missed opportunity in tapping into our collective suffering to bring us together and make us stronger, right? So that, to me, is a huge psychological problem. And because the U.S. is, you know, world's wealthy country, a powerful country, how we do things doesn't just affect Americans, it affects everyone around the world. And then speaking of global issues, psychologically, we've become more internally focused in our initial response to the pandemic. As I mentioned, issues around widespread famines that are happening across the globe are things that are, for some of us, on our periphery, for others, completely out of our scope of attention. And I think that psychologically, if we are not asked to look beyond our more narrow local context, then it's very easy to ignore that broader context. And you could say it's a moral responsibility. You can look at it from an ethical perspective, but more than that, I would say there's opportunities there that are wasted if we just focus internally. There's opportunities lost in terms of untapped resources, collaboration and cooperation to come up with solutions that we ourselves do not have if we just look at our domestic space.
Mm-hmm.
I've been thinking a lot about government and international international context. Let me focus specifically on the organizational context. People compartmentalize sort of how they act at work versus how they act at home. And what I've been hearing from manufacturing companies, for example, demand is up. They're trying to produce as much as they can. And then they're also trying to create guidelines to ensure their worker safety. But they have these funny, not funny issues where, you come into a plant and your temperature is taken and you're trying to be, socially distanced and whatnot. But then you see an outbreak that actually resulted from the 6 guys who were carpooling to work that day, who were then psychologically or socially distanced throughout the day. And so people I think are having a hard time thinking about, this as a problem that transcends all of their spheres of reality and influence.
Thank you. We talked about this section of the program. It's both a conversation and a workshop, and we've got a couple of good workshop-y type questions that have come in. So here's your opportunity to provide some coaching to our audience. How would you approach a manager whose team it has been required, as so many of ours are, to work remotely, probably for the first time? And he comes to you and he says he's struggling and he can't control his team.
Okay, so
limited context, I know.
As a coach, I would say more. So look, again, there's a dichotomy in how some of us see life. The manager who says, I can't control my team, I would normally say, have you ever been able to control your team, right? We don't control others in the workplace. I mean, some of us, again, one perspective, this is the perspective that many take if they are using monitoring tools. They're trying to figure out, like, how long are you staring at the screen and are you productive when you're doing it? Those are measures that are trying to enact some modicum of control, because what we talked about earlier in terms of trust, I would argue that it's because trust is lacking. And when you take a control and monitoring perspective, again, people are just trying to minimize risk. How do I not get caught, right? That's the mindset. If you take a different perspective and think about, how do I encourage my employees to do the best they can during this time? Completely different mindset. Right? I'm not thinking, how am I going to get caught? How can I avoid getting caught? But I'm thinking about, what is it that I can do, right? Which typically is, how can I go above and beyond? We are motivated by not letting other people down. We're motivated by our individual pride in our own work. I mean, those are the psychological circumstances that allow us to really excel.
So here's kind of a complementary question to the previous one. And I'm not sure if this is coming from the vantage point of the leader or someone on the leader's team.
Okay.
The question is, how can a leader develop more empathy towards the team? I suspect this might be someone on a team whose leader perhaps lacks empathy, but I would like to think that the answer to the question would be the same.
So it's a complicated question to answer in a precise way in terms of scholarship, because what most of us think about when we say empathy is actually perspective taking, right? So empathy is, the experience that somebody else has had. I've had that and can tap into, right, that common experience. And there are ways to increase empathy, absolutely. They typically require taking somebody out of their comfort zone and out of their current context. A different way to think about it is, can you put yourself in that other person's shoes? That's perspective taking, right? So if I were a single parent who moved to a new city and this happened, right? Putting myself in that person's shoes, right? Let's say he does not have family support, he does not have the friend circle, and his child is school age but requires a lot of attention, of course. And so as a manager, I might not have kids, or I might not have small kids at home anymore, and often we forget what that's like. So thinking about what would make that person's life easier. And if you don't know, ask, right? So if you can't relate to the experience personally, being able to open up a conversation about that is important. Now, I've been talking about the employee and what a manager can do, okay? Leading up, of course, is always more difficult because of the power difference. That's and I talk a lot about this with my students and clients. What we often forget is that, like, managers are humans too. They're fallible individuals. Everything they do isn't premeditated and on purpose. And so being able to see that individual as someone who is struggling, perhaps in different ways, but opening up the conversation, not just in terms of, you need to know this about me, but also what is happening, right, in your life? How can I help with that? Or can we talk about that? Is an incredibly effective way to start showing some level of solidarity and develop perspective taking to understand what your manager's position is. I've seen incredibly successful instances where, through this type of conversation, I mean, you're informing your manager of blind spots that perhaps were not apparent to him or her without this type of exchange.
As long as we're conscious, conscious of the fact that we have those blind spots, right? Don't you? There's this weird, yeah.
We all have blind spots, Paul.
Yeah. No, indeed. I think what I was going with, boy, do I know that. I'd like to think, so I'm going to go on a quick tangent here. Are there exercises, for lack of a better word, to remind ourselves that we have blind spots and we need to be continually aware of that fact? I think it's actually easy. We all know that, right? I think we're all well aware.
We are well aware.
And yet, in times of crisis, when times are busy, perhaps busy in ways that we're not accustomed to, we might forget that, yes. Or we might be less attuned to be on the lookout for them.
Well, and I think this is feedback is a common effective mechanism during crisis. Asking for feedback typically isn't where we're going, but at this point, we're at a point where we've sort of stabilized into the new normal. We know that this is going to last for a while. So again, what are the new routines that you have to create to get feedback from your staff, right? You can stop and say, how has the past month been going? What's worked? What hasn't worked? And to the extent that you're comfortable doing that, on a call, or if you want to create a survey where you're able to get that type of input from your employees, I mean, right now is the time to ask for that feedback that can allow you to minimize those blind spots.
Great. I'm gonna combine a viewer comment and a couple of questions that are all kind of on a similar theme. The comment: we should have thought about leading with humanity before the pandemic. They said way before the pandemic. Should this be a lesson learned? And what does it reveal about how we educate people and train people to become managers?
So currently we're focusing on this. because I'm a management scholar, in this realm of academia, the conversation about humanistic practices has been ongoing. This has not been an area that's been ignored, or individuals that actually study these types of dynamics have not been unaware. And in fact, we have a lot of evidence, empirical evidence, that when we treat people as humans and we are able to develop, for example, a sense of belonging in the organization that taps into common values, where people are able to express their identity, where they don't feel marginalized in their organizational workplaces. All of those things we know can increase the human capacity to excel and be generative. So it's not that we have been ignoring it. I do, and I work for a business school, but I work for a business school who's, the Darden School. The reason I came to the Darden School is because of our values. And I think that a focus on the importance of understanding different stakeholders, the importance of community, is not only taught in the classroom, but if you talk to faculty here, that sense of community is lived. And so as we think about, the people training the next generation of managers, as we refine our response to this crisis, I do hope that more of us move toward a community and stakeholder-oriented approach. But again, these debates have been ongoing for a long time.
And so I think a follow-on question to that: what can parents be doing at home with our children? We're spending more, perhaps, hopefully, quality time with our children than maybe we ever have, both to kind of embody this broader sense of responsibility that you're encouraging us to think about, and even to begin to kind of prepare themselves for a new type of leadership that's going to be required.
So I would never want to give, parents direct advice, because we all have, idiosyncratic, situations. So, but I will recommend different things to think about. One is going back to these personal relationships. I think in the U.S. and as compared to more collectivistic nations, the family unit typically is the parents and the kids, and then, maybe a large concentric circle out would be grandparents and aunts and so forth. I think this is an opportunity to bring that family unit a bit closer. I realized how meaningful it was, for example, when my son played his newest piano piece over the phone to my parents. And it was a piano piece that I had played when I was a child, and that was an emotional moment. But so simple to be able to share that with grandparents. In other ways, right, to connect. I think that's the message there in terms of personal relationships. Another way to think about this as a parent is, what are the skills that your kids need, right, in life? And if you've been waiting to teach them those skills, for example, laundry, dishes, cleaning, we often think about, and this is, it's comical in the US, where a child or a teenager is ready to go to college, and you realize, wow, he or she doesn't know how to do laundry, right? That person is 17 or 18 years old. Let's start that earlier. And so what are the useful life skills of survival, cooking, gardening, that we can do as a family, and be able to give them something that will be useful, in perpetuity.
Thank you. As we think about, who are kind of our most vulnerable populations and vulnerable workers within an organization, I think that there are some kind of common traits that would be on the lookout for, but I wonder if there are things that we might be overlooking. I think vulnerability might take on kind of a broader meaning in a time like this?
Yes.
Fair enough.
I mean,
Yeah.
vulnerability where? I mean, we have enormous opportunities to, so the way I look at it, back to this issue of context, is we have enormous opportunities to fix the structures and systems that perpetually make some of us more vulnerable than others, right? Whether it's, if you look at the educational system, those kids who can no longer go to school, and besides the fact that they're not learning, they're not getting a school lunch, right? During the summer, we typically have backpack programs to try to bridge the gap. But why is it that in the world's wealthiest country, we still can't figure out a way to make sure that all of our kids are fed, right? And so those are the individuals that are most vulnerable among us. This crisis has revealed how perhaps tenuous the structures and systems are that are in place, sort of band-aid solutions to these bigger issues.
Coming out of this, do you think businesses will kind of embrace their social responsibilities and maybe just to be more human-driven and less capital-driven going forward? Is that a pipe dream or is that realistic?
I think it depends what industry you're talking about. If we look at our public healthcare system, this crisis has revealed that if we make every hospital, for-profit business and generally disconnected from hospitals in other regions in the United States, when you have a surge and you need hospital beds, they're acting much more like hotels where you just run out of capacity versus being able to flexibly, reach out to other hospitals and increase that capacity. So there's an issue there. I mean, public health system, you could have an entire webinar or 2 or 4 or 100 talking about the issues there. But if you're in a space of public health, you're much more likely to be rethinking some fundamental issues. If you're in a space where you are, closely tied to the supply chain, the food supply chain, then you might be rethinking some issues around, how can we ensure a greater degree of equity? But you might also be thinking about the fact that if our supply chains are so globally distributed that we can't get access to the medicines that we need or the equipment that we need, the pandemic is going to make you rethink how you structure and optimize those supply chains. If you're in any type of environmentally related area, this is because of climate change. This is not going to be the last pandemic, perhaps in our lifetime. And so how do you create a burning platform for the changes that need to be made so that our environment is not as disrupted?
Thank you. We're just coming up on the top of the hour. I just wanted to offer you just kind of a quick opportunity for a closing remark, if you'd like.
Yeah, so I thank you, Paul. I appreciate it, and I'm incredibly grateful to the folks who have signed in, our viewers and listeners. I appreciate the opportunity. What I would hope people take away from this hour is perhaps a greater sense of agency that within each of us we have the potential to make a positive impact in our local communities, in our personal and family and friend relationships, and we have the ability to make a difference despite the uncertainty that faces us now.
Thank you, Mirella. I think this is a really inspiring session.